There comes a moment in life when you understand that trusting family without limits can cost you more than you ever expected. My name is Alicia Bennett. I am 34 years old, and the life I built is centered on independence because I learned very early that peace only exists when you protect the space that belongs to you. I worked relentlessly so I could live alone, manage my own home, and believe that the people closest to me would respect the boundaries once they were clearly set. That belief shattered the evening I stepped through my front door and immediately noticed things that did not belong there. Bags I had never seen before leaned casually against the wall near my entryway. Shoes that were not mine sat neatly lined up beside the door. Several boxes were stacked beside my furniture, as if someone had quietly decided that my home had suddenly become a shared space without my knowledge. My chest tightened as the realization settled in. My mother had used the spare key I gave her and brought my unemployed sister into my house without asking me first. Not for a short visit, not to talk about a problem. They had moved her in as if they had every right to do it. I stood in the middle of my living room, taking in the scene around me, and spoke calmly without raising my voice. You do not get to live here. This is my house. I expected resistance, maybe even embarrassment or an apology. What I received instead was quiet expectation, as if the situation had already been decided long before I walked through the door. There was no panic, no regret in their expressions, just the silent assumption that I would eventually accept it. I picked up my phone. My hands were steady, even though my heart was pounding harder than I wanted to admit. When the operator answered, I spoke clearly. There are people inside my home who entered without my permission, and they are refusing to leave. The police arrived not long after. Their voices were measured and calm, their movements controlled. I stood in the hallway, watching as my mother and my sister were escorted out of the life I had built piece by piece for myself. When the door finally closed behind them, I believed the situation was finished. But 2 days later, I woke up to a sound that immediately sent a chill through my chest. It was the harsh scrape of metal grinding against my front door. The noise was deliberate, patient, and wrong. I reached for my phone and opened the security camera feed. What I saw on the screen made my stomach drop. My mother was standing outside the door with a locksmith beside her. I watched as he carefully inserted his tools into the lock, turning them with practiced movements, as if what he was doing were completely normal. As if he had never been told that he was forcing entry into someone else's home. I did not hesitate. I did not panic. By that point, something inside me had already shifted. I picked up my phone and made another call, my voice calm and steady. Because by then I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Some people will continue crossing your boundaries until you force them to stop. If you have ever had someone ignore your limits simply because they share your blood, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share your story in the comments. What happened after that moment was far worse than most people would expect. Years before everything fell apart, my life had already begun drifting away from the people who raised me. Independence was never a sudden choice I made one day. It developed slowly over time, shaped by years of watching what happened when I relied too heavily on anyone else. I saw promises break. I watched expectations change without warning. I learned how easily affection could turn into obligation. So I began constructing a life that belonged entirely to me, one quiet decision at a time. I worked long hours, saved every extra dollar I could, avoided unnecessary comforts, and accepted loneliness rather than depending on people who might one day decide they had control over me. Loneliness, at least, felt honest. The distance between me and my mother, Linda, did not come from open anger. It came from a kind of pressure that never had a clear name. Conversations with her often felt less like discussions and more like inspections. Every question sounded like an evaluation. Every suggestion felt like a subtle command. Even silence carried a weight, the kind of disappointment that hides behind carefully chosen words of concern. Over time, I found myself measuring what I said whenever I was around her. I adjusted my choices to avoid conflict. I hid parts of my life that felt too personal to explain. It was easier to shrink certain truths than to deal with the heaviness that followed whenever she disapproved. My sister Rachel had always existed somewhere along the edge of my life. She was close enough to see the things I worked for, yet distant enough to misunderstand them completely. She moved through life with the quiet assumption that something would eventually appear to solve her problems: a new opportunity, a helping hand, a last-minute rescue. Because of that difference between us, I learned not to talk openly about my progress. Any success I mentioned seemed to hang in the space between us like a silent accusation neither of us wanted to acknowledge. There were no explosive arguments between us, no dramatic confrontations, just a quiet tension that lived inside long pauses, brief glances, and conversations that ended earlier than they should have. By the time I finally bought my home using my own savings, I did not feel the excitement most people expect from such a milestone. Instead of celebrating, I kept the achievement mostly private. Happiness felt delicate in a family where control often disguised itself as concern. The spare key I gave my mother was never meant to represent trust in the romantic sense of family closeness. The night I handed it to her, I looked directly into her eyes and explained the conditions carefully. My voice was calm, and I made sure there was no confusion. That key was for emergencies only, real emergencies, situations where I could not be reached and something serious had happened. It was not meant for casual visits. It was not meant for convenience. It was not meant for decisions that were not hers to make. She held the key in her hand quietly for a moment, studying it as if weighing its meaning. Then she nodded once and said nothing more. At the time, I interpreted that silence as agreement. I believed that my boundaries had finally been understood. What I did not realize then was that understanding something and accepting it are not always the same thing. About 2 months before everything finally exploded, I began to feel a strange heaviness around my life that I could not immediately explain. Something felt off, though I could not point to a specific reason. I did not learn about Rachel's housing situation from my mother, and Rachel herself never mentioned it to me. Instead, the information reached me through a distant relative during a casual conversation that had nothing to do with family conflict. That somehow made the news feel even more real and unsettling. They mentioned quietly that Rachel no longer had stable housing. It was not said like gossip or drama, just a simple statement of fact, the kind of truth that settles into the back of your mind and refuses to leave, no matter how hard you try to ignore it. Rachel never called me about it. She never sent a message asking for help. She never appeared at my door asking if she could stay. Instead, her presence appeared around me without her ever stepping inside, like a shadow that slowly stretched across a wall until you noticed it was already there. I felt it through the way Mom began showing up more often, not to spend time with me, not to talk about my life, but to walk through my space with eyes that studied instead of admired. Mom began to treat my home like a place that needed evaluation rather than respect. She opened doors I usually kept closed. She stood silently in the hallway, longer than necessary. She looked at the spare room in a way that made my skin tighten slightly, even though she had not yet said anything openly. Her voice stayed soft, but her intention started to feel louder than her words. One afternoon, while she stood near the doorway of the guest room, she said something that felt simple on the surface, but heavy underneath. She looked around calmly and said, "No one should live alone in a house like this." The tone was gentle, but there was something inside that sentence that shifted the balance of the room. It was not a suggestion. It felt like a test. I did not argue. I did not accuse her of planning anything. I did not raise my voice or challenge her in that moment because I understood that real intentions are rarely revealed when someone feels threatened. Instead, I started to observe her more carefully, noticing how often her gaze returned to the same spaces, how loneliness and responsibility in conversations that were never meant to be about any of those things. The longer this continued, the more I began to feel that this was no longer about concern. It felt like preparation. It felt like positioning. It felt like small movements being made quietly before a larger decision was forced into the open without my consent. By the end of that period, I understood something important. Even though I had no proof yet, the attention Mom showed toward my home did not come from love or protection anymore. It came from a direction I had not agreed to, and from a plan I had never been asked to be part of. Not long after that, during a work trip, I began to feel a familiar sense of unease, the kind of feeling that usually appears just before something quietly falls apart. The trip itself was related to real estate, a series of property evaluations I had been managing for weeks, which meant long inspections, paperwork, and constant movement between buildings that all looked similar, but demanded different levels of attention. I had planned to stay away longer to finish everything properly, But the uneasy pressure in my chest grew stronger with each passing night, so I decided to return early without telling anyone. When I opened my front door, the air inside the house felt unfamiliar, even though nothing looked obviously destroyed. There were boxes stacked near the wall that I knew did not belong to me, bags sitting near the entryway that had never been there before, and objects placed carefully, as if someone had planned their positions rather than dropped them in a hurry. The arrangement was calm, almost respectful, which somehow made the situation feel more invasive instead of less. I moved further inside with slow steps, trying to understand how everything could feel occupied without looking chaotic. And that was the moment Rachel stepped into view. She did not look startled. She did not look ashamed. Her posture was relaxed in a way that suggested she believed she had every right to be there. I asked her what she was doing inside my home, not in a raised voice, not in a desperate tone, but with the quiet pressure of someone trying to keep control of their own reality. She looked at me and said, "Mom said it was already handled." That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else she could have said, because it answered nothing while explaining everything at the same time. I understood in that moment that this was not a misunderstanding, not a mistake, not an awkward family favor, but a decision that had been made without my presence, my permission, or my consent. As I walked further through my own house, I began to notice how precise the changes were. My belongings had been shifted slightly to make room. Drawers had been reorganized. A spare space that I had kept intentionally empty had been prepared to serve a different purpose. The clarity hit me slowly, not as fear, but as something sharper, because I realized that the emergency key I had given for protection had been used as a tool of access, not safety. I did not fall into old emotions. I did not collapse into shock. I did not panic in ways I once might have. What I felt instead was a clean and controlled understanding that my privacy had been taken from me in a way that could not be explained as care. My home had turned into a shared space without my agreement, and that was a violation I could not ignore or soften. Rachel moved around the space, casually touching surfaces, adjusting items, behaving like someone who had already moved in rather than someone waiting for approval. I watched the way she placed her things without asking, the way she walked without hesitation, the way she spoke without concern for reaction. In that moment, I understood that the key had never been about emergencies. It had become a quiet permission slip that I never meant to give. I stood there without shouting, without pleading, without begging for reason. Because respect does not live in arguments when the boundary has already been broken. What mattered was not the conversation. What mattered was the line that had been crossed without hesitation. By the time I left that room, my mind felt clearer than it had in a long time, because I knew that whatever came next would not be about emotion, family, or compromise, but about ownership, control, and a line that could no longer be treated as negotiable. The next morning, I realized I was done negotiating. I stood in the living room facing Mom without the softness I used to carry whenever she crossed a line, because something inside me had shifted overnight into a clarity that felt heavier than fear, but steadier than anger. I told her that ownership was not a feeling, not a suggestion, not a flexible idea shaped by blood or history, but a legal and personal reality that no one was allowed to touch simply because they shared my last name. Then I asked her to leave, in a voice that did not rise and did not shake. Rachel stepped into the room slowly, carrying the kind of dissatisfaction that stretched the moment longer than it needed to be, using quiet sighs and wounded expressions to press against me instead of offering real words, creating a tight emotional pressure that wrapped around the air like something physical rather than spoken. She spoke about family in a way that treated guilt as obligation, making the space feel suffocating instead of conversational, while I remained still and refused to soften the boundaries I had already spoken aloud. I told them clearly that the emergency key was not permission, not access, not an open door for comfort or assumption, explaining that it existed for danger, only for real threat, for situations where life or safety was at risk, not for convenience, control, or silent decisions made in my absence. I said that using it without fear or consent was not helping a family member. It was trespassing. And the word hung in the room in a way that could not be taken back. The thought of calling 911 did not arrive as panic. It arrived as a slow and deliberate process that moved through guilt, memory, hesitation, loyalty, fear, and something deeper that I had not allowed myself to feel before, which was relief. I thought about everything I had compromised in the past to avoid conflict, about how often I had swallowed my own discomfort to preserve peace that was never real, about how the idea of dialing those numbers felt like betrayal and survival in the same breath. My hands did not shake when I held the phone yet. My chest felt like it carried every argument I had avoided across the years, every apology I made for things that were not my fault, every moment where I let silence replace truth because it felt safer at the time. I realized that staying silent had never protected me. It had only trained them to step further into my space with confidence. When the police arrived, their voices were calm, their movements measured, and their presence carried the neutral weight that comes with authority that does not take sides immediately. They asked to see documentation, reviewed ownership papers, checked identification quietly, and spoke to each of us separately without raised volume or visible judgment, creating a strange stillness that made the situation feel official in a way that words alone never could. One officer explained to Mom that entering without consent carried legal consequences, even when family was involved, choosing words that sounded like caution rather than punishment, which made the moment feel unfinished rather than resolved. There was no handcuffs, no dramatic removal, no final consequence, only a formal warning that hung in the air like a clock that had started ticking instead of stopping. When they left, the house felt larger, quieter, heavier, and more honest, because something fundamental had changed inside me that could not be undone by apologies, excuses, or promises, and I understood that this was not the end of anything, only the first time I chose myself without asking permission. 2 days later, the sound that woke me did not feel dramatic, but it felt wrong in a way that made my body react before my mind caught up. Metal tapped softly at first, then scraped along the frame of my front door, in slow, careful movements that had nothing to do with accident or coincidence. I stayed still in bed for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling while my heartbeat rose steadily in my ears, trying to decide if I was imagining the noise or if someone was truly outside touching my door. I reached for my phone without turning on the light, opened the security app, and brought up the live camera feed from the front porch. The image was clear because the motion light had already triggered. Mom stood close to the door, her posture calm, arms folded loosely across her chest. Beside her was a man I had never seen before, crouched low with a small black case open near his knees. His hands worked with thin metal tools that slipped inside the lock with a confidence that came from practice, not from curiosity.
Mom did not look nervous, rushed, or defensive. She looked patient, as though she were waiting for a repair job to be finished, rather than standing inches away from committing a crime. That quiet confidence scared me more than the tools did. There was no shouting, no arguing, no pleading, only the sound of metal working against metal. I moved slowly through the hallway, keeping my footsteps controlled so the floor would not betray me. I stayed far enough back from the door to remain unseen, but close enough to feel the vibration each time the tools scraped the mechanism. My hands felt heavy while holding the phone, but I knew what I had to do. When I called 911 the second time, my voice did not shake at first. It felt steady in my throat, almost practiced, as I gave my address and explained that someone was actively trying to enter my home. My fingers began trembling only after the operator asked me who the person outside might be. Saying the word mother out loud felt like pushing a blade through my own chest. The familiarity of reporting someone who had once held my hand as a child made my stomach tighten. Yet the fear of what she was doing pushed me forward. The operator asked me to stay on the line. I stayed silent while the sounds at the door grew more deliberate. The man shifted his weight and adjusted his tools. Mom stepped closer to him, said something I could not hear. Her face never changed. Red and blue lights painted the front of my house in slow flashes before I ever heard the sirens. This time the arrival felt heavier. Commands came through sharp voices amplified by the quiet street. I watched through the camera feed as the officers moved fast, weapons drawn, ordering the man to drop his tools and lie face down on the ground. He froze for a fraction of a second before obeying, arms stretched out and cheek pressed against the concrete. Mom was pulled several steps away from the door. One officer kept a hand lightly but firmly around her arm, while another spoke into a radio and began writing on a clipboard. There was no friendly time this time, no casual warnings, no soft explanations. Everything moved like a machine that had finally been dropped into a higher gear. I stayed behind the locked door while it all unfolded. I did not step outside. I did not open the lock. I stood there listening to muffled voices through thick wood, listening to the sound of paper shifting and pen scratching while something official was being created in my name. Through the camera, I saw Mom speaking firmly, still composed, still convinced that whatever she was doing belonged within her rights. Her face showed irritation rather than shame. In that moment, something inside me shifted without ceremony. There was no explosion of emotion, no dramatic thought. I understood quietly and completely that she was not going to stop. This was not a misunderstanding that could be explained away. This was not a mistake born from worry or concern. This was a pattern that had crossed into danger. I remained still until the lights faded and the sounds of doors shutting echoed down the street. Only then did I lower the phone from my shaking hands and breathe again fully. I did not feel victory. I did not feel sadness. I felt clarity,
and that clarity was colder and heavier than anything I had felt before. 1 week later, I stopped believing that silence meant peace, because silence began to feel like a place where plans could hide. I started cleaning through the last of the items that had been left behind, not because I wanted to preserve them, but because I needed to remove every trace that did not belong to me. Inside a thin cardboard box that had been pushed to the back of a hallway closet, I found a sealed envelope that did not have my handwriting on it. The paper felt heavier than normal, the kind of weight that made my fingers tense before I even opened it. Inside were printed forms that carried my name, my address, my signature, and descriptions of long-term residential permission that I had never applied for or approved. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was a misunderstanding, but the longer I looked at the lines, the spacing, and the looping strokes at the bottom, the clearer it became that the handwriting was not mine. That night, I made an appointment with my lawyer, Daniel Harper, because this no longer felt like a family problem that could be talked through quietly. From that moment forward, I referred to him only as Daniel, because I needed someone who saw this as law, not emotion, and I needed someone who would not soften the edges of what was happening. Daniel sat across from me quietly as he reviewed each page, moving slower with every document, and the way his jaw tightened told me more than any words could have.
He explained to me that if those papers had ever been filed, even partially, someone could have argued that I had given legal permission for another person to establish residence in my home, which could have opened the door to property disputes that might take years to unravel. He told me that in situations like this, silence is often the most dangerous response because it allows false documents to grow roots inside legal systems before the real owner even realizes something has been planted. He explained that this was no longer about hurt feelings, broken trust, or emotional boundaries, but about protecting ownership, intent, and legal control over what I had built with my own effort. As I listened, something shifted inside me because I finally saw the shape of the entire situation clearly. This had never been about letting Rachel stay for a while, and it was never about Mom trying to help in the way that parents sometimes do. This was a slow, deliberate movement toward control, one that relied on guilt, pressure, and assumptions, rather than permission or truth. I felt something steady replace the confusion in my chest, because I understood that if they had been successful, I might have woken up one day inside a home that no longer legally belonged to me in the way I believed, tangled inside courtrooms instead of hallways, trying to prove that my life had been taken without my consent. That was the moment I decided there would be no more conversations, no more explanations, and no more attempts to repair something that was not broken by accident. I stopped responding to messages. I stopped acknowledging calls. I stopped leaving room for doubt inside my own mind. With Daniel's guidance, I began preparing formal documentation that would protect the property, block any attempt to file residency claims, and create a clear legal record that I had never granted permission for anyone else to gain rights over my home. I worked through each step carefully because this was no longer emotional work. It was structural work, designed to protect the foundation of my life. For the first time since everything began, I no longer felt small or confused because clarity replaced hesitation and preparation replaced fear inside my chest. A quiet sense of control settled in my thoughts, giving me steadiness instead of panic, certainty instead of confusion, and direction instead of doubt. I understood that whatever came next would not catch me unguarded because I was no longer simply reacting to their actions. I was actively building boundaries that could not be crossed quietly or dismantled in the dark. Several months later, life no longer felt fragile inside my own walls. It felt quiet, structured, deliberate. That quiet did not come from forgiveness, closure, or emotional repair. It came from paperwork, courtroom signatures, and the kind of legal language that leaves no space for negotiation. Mom faced administrative penalties after the second documented incident was fully reviewed. The result was not symbolic. She received formal sanctions, was legally prohibited from approaching or interacting with any property connected to my name, and permanently lost any right to request, file, or interfere in housing-related decisions that involved me. There were no dramatic scenes in that process, only forms, hearings, verifications, and a steady removal of influence that had no path to return. Rachel was forced to leave the city quietly without the ability to establish residency or continue any unlawful presence. She had no protection, left no structure to lean on, and no remaining path to stay nearby. The reality that followed her was simple and unprotected. She had to solve her own life without borrowed authority, without hidden access, without someone speaking on her behalf. I did not track where she went. I did not need to. Distance created its own form of conclusion. Inside the house, everything physical changed. I replaced every lock. I reinforced every entry point. The security system was redesigned and extended. Cameras covered angles I never thought I would need when I bought the place. Motion detection became layered.
Alerts became instant. Access became singular. Through my lawyer, I established clear legal boundaries that existed on paper and inside official registries, so that no claim, no signature, no attempt at residency could be attempted quietly again. That process changed something in me that could not be reversed. For a long time, I believed family meant tolerance, patience, and emotional endurance. I learned that unprotected empathy allows people to cross limits without fear. I learned that allowing repeated access in the name of blood creates danger that grows in silence. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are structure. They are safety. They are self-respect. No relationship, no title, no shared history justifies the removal of your right to feel safe where you live. Protecting yourself is not betrayal. It is responsibility. If you stayed with this story until the end, I want to thank you with sincerity. Your time matters. Your attention matters. If you have ever experienced someone using closeness as a way to push into spaces that should have remained yours, you are not alone. You are not dramatic. You are not wrong. You deserve peace in your own life. If this story resonated with you, feel free to share your experience in the comments, or use this space as a reminder that you are allowed to protect what belongs to you.